All right, YouTube, I've spoken before about some of the dangers inherent within prophecy, within, well, the occult in general. I covered that, but specifically with regards to the concept of self-fulfilling prophecies, sort of convergences of prophecies, even more so, where different cultures, the periods that they've spoken of having something to do with a spiritual path in some way, the end times, the ending of a cycle, certain events unfolding, whatever, or just people's interpretation of more vague prophetic materials, where they converge, there is a risk to this world. I think it's probably time to talk about it because the Shemitah is almost upon us. The blood moon cycle is about to end. This particular cycle, the blood moon tetrad, and people, of course, those of a religious type, those who follow, let's say, fundamentalist Christianity. Certain New Age groups have basically covered the same thing. Even secular individuals who believe in economic cycles, as they may overlap, may or may not overlap with religious cycles of certain importance. They are all talking about this in great fervor and will for the next couple of weeks until this last cycle ends. I would like to point this out. I said this briefly before with the concept of the red heifer, the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, and so forth. I said whether or not the prophetic material itself has any validity. It can be completely and utterly made up. It doesn't really matter. If enough people believe in it, and if the end result of the change in their actions affects other groups around them in proximity, or even in not in proximity in some cases, there is a risk there that it has an effect upon society, one or more societies, political systems, the way people conduct warfare, the way people conduct trade. You would think of, for instance, in the early Jehovah's Witnesses, they predicted that the end times were coming back in the 1920s. A great many Jehovah's Witnesses, as the result of their belief that the end times was coming, even though it didn't, quite clearly, almost 100 years later, we're still here. Enough people believed in it that they sold everything that they owned, and a very large proportion of them became penniless. They sold everything, they gave everything away, and they sort of gathered out in the desert to wait for the end times. When it didn't come, some of these people were screwed. Later on, they suggested that the end times was coming as well, I believe in the 1940s, and said that the only safe city left on earth would be Jerusalem, so they should all make their way to what was then mandatory Palestine under the British government, and thousands of them actually did. Some of them got stuck there because they could not afford to actually get their way back. You've had some people lately saying, oh, well, the East Coast will be destroyed, everyone should go to Minnesota. For some reason, that has significance to certain groups in the current sort of prophetic movements that are about today. So you've got all of these different people, and especially when you've got an ancient prophecy that is more widely believed in, seen as more historically credible, against the backdrop of some other religious movement, some other religious force, you have the tendency for people to take these things seriously. Even if the prophecy itself was bunk, that's one possibility. It could be that the person that penned it didn't know what they were talking about, and it will never actually come true. It could be wrongfully interpreted. A lot of people are talking about, for instance, Newton's statements regarding his own sort of equations revolving around biblical materials. Well, depending upon how you interpret them, the date should have already come or is coming in the next month or two, or doesn't come till like 2080 something. So you've got the possibility of wrongful interpretation or vague interpretation. You'd think of Nostradamus or any of these people making prophetic materials that nonetheless are not specific, they are not explicit, they are rather vague, and can be interpreted many ways. You would say the same about some of the materials within the Bible. And of course, then, the big problem comes when you have prophetic materials that have been compiled with other prophetic materials that post-date the events that they talk about, like in the Bible. Bible was not fully canonized and in a semi-modern form until the 300s, while a great many of the prophecies that are in the Bible are written retrospectively. They're written about past events. Thus, they appear to predict them. People at the time just took it as a token of faith that they had correctly predicted these things. They had a general belief in such things. Now that you have many, many hundreds of millions, in fact billions of people who believe in the general Bible, even though those prophetic materials are wrapped up with other works of different date and author, they then take the other prophetic materials, something like the Revelation, seriously, the Revelation of St. John. They don't look at it as a steganography or as metaphor or as something that was written essentially as a political tract against Roman oppression at the time and was simply hidden as though it was a prophecy. They don't take that under consideration. They think of it as an actual prophecy. The danger of the convergence and the current period that we're in is exceptionally dangerous. I would warn people that looking around the world today, it looks a lot like the 1930s. It looks a lot like the pre-World War II era. I know people are fond of pointing out, well, the styles are kind of 80s-ish, some of the music's like 90s-ish, there's some like Dylan-sounding music and stuff. Ignore all of that. Yes, that part of culture matters. As far as the socio-political standing of the world today, it looks a lot like pre-World War II. You've got a lot of great powers that have sort of put all these other countries in their sphere. You've got oppression going on. You've got mass migration in various directions. You've got social alienation exactly like you had. You've got the rise of nativism in parts of the West. You've got the rise of theocratic sentiments elsewhere. You've got a rise in nationalism in some of the Asian countries. You've got increasing militarism. Nations that were pacifistic for decades have rearmed. Japan is one of them. And while I don't generally worry about the Japanese suddenly invading China, it does begin to look quite similar to the world situation as it stood roughly before the German economy collapsed the second time around, leading to over and over riots and protests and revolutions in which hardliners, communists and national socialists, were basically fighting it out in the streets for dominance. You could see a situation similar to that unfurl. The re-rising of nationalism, imperialism, nativism, and all of these things, communism could come back in some of these countries as people become stressed, because a population that is under stress will turn to fringe political and social elements that it would otherwise ignore. That's exactly what happened in Germany. It happened in Italy. It happened in Russia. Why did the Russians adopt communism? Would they have adopted it if their way of life was generally stable and they had enough to eat and they weren't starving and they hadn't just gone through several fairly disastrous battles in Kamchatka? Would they have turned to communism? Probably not. They probably would have maintained the czarist status quo if the czars hadn't been so ineffectual and if it hadn't been for continuous famine, which was continued under Stalin. The famines didn't go away, of course. The occult convergence we're currently going through is manifold. That is, that it's not a convergence like you may have had before, where you have two doomsday preachers who have predicted the end times many times before anyway, just happen to pick a similar date, and some people on the very fringe of Christianity or Islam or something get worried. You've got multiple prophetic materials. In Islam, you've got the concept of a fire coming from what is now the Yemeni area, basically. A fire from Yemen that predates the end of the world. Well, the Islamists, some of them, the ones that believe in such prophecies, particularly within Shia groups, they believe that it's happening currently and that the Mahdi is about to come back. Because look at what's happening in Yemen. The Christians believe, of course, they've believed for 2,000 years we're in the end times, but you've got more predictors now because of the social consciousness bred on the internet and their ability to sort of fling these prophecies around. You've got a lot more cultural paranoia among the more evangelical Christian groups. The rise of nativism is not helping, by the way, the rise of the sort of right populism. You've got the Mayan calendar still fresh in people's minds, because it wasn't 2012, it was 2013 that it actually predicted, well, the end of the cycles there doesn't correspond to a disastrous sort of end of all time, end of humanity. It corresponds to the beginning of a new cycle, Generally, cycles in these systems are born out of fire, they're born out of chaos, they're born out of war, butchery, famine, pestilence, and everything else that's negative to mankind. You've got the Norse pagans in Britain declaring that we're in Ragnarok currently. You've got Time Wave Zero. You've got some of these Hopi traditions that people in sort of these psychonaut groups talk about, and they would also delve perhaps into Time Wave Zero also, which they only artificially corresponded with 2012 retrospectively, but still, they believe in it. You see, the thing is, it doesn't matter if the prophecy is properly interpreted, if it increases social consciousness about its own existence and converges with other prophecies that have been taken as such. The Jews right now are awaiting their Moshiach, their Messiah. There are plans, active plans, as in not shitting you plans, to rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. If it is rebuilt, it will probably lead to a war in the region. Many people don't even comprehend it. They don't even think about the rebuilding of the temple. They think, oh, well, the prophecy was fulfilled. The Jews are back in Israel. Well, not until they rebuild their temple. You see, that's the problem. And Zionist Christians here would probably support it. Of course, they would ignore the fact that it would require the destruction of several important archaeological sites. But then again, the Israelis have been doing that at the Temple Mount anyway. They've been removing all sorts of materials there. The Islamists do that too around Jerusalem. They're both constantly removing materials from other cultures other than their own to make it look like they were the only ones there. That's what they do. They do want to offer their red heifer. They do want to burn a 3-year-old calf to ashes and use the ashes to purify the Temple Mount. This would cause uproar among the Islamic community. The Islamists really want the Jews out of the Temple Mount. The Israeli authorities want to sort of keep the peace. It's impossible to do so. People are marching on the Mount all the time now, getting beaten down. Eventually it will boil over. But you've got all of these different prophecies converging around this time, and the blood moon cycle, which is a rather, it's not exactly the most common of events to have a blood moon tetrad. That is true, and you could say it does have occult connotations. As far as it meaning the end of the world, that's all really in the eye of the beholder. If enough people believe in something, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. The Nazis believed they had descended from Atlantis and that they had been in exile in the far north to purify their race, and that now they were the Ubermensch and they were ready to take over, what had been traditionally, I guess, their sort of core of land. They believed in it enough to launch themselves into World War II and declare later on, oh, well, now it's Lebensraum time because these commies don't deserve their land. Regardless of what you think about the sides that were involved, that was one of the bases upon which they put their ideology. That was one of the foundations of what they believed in and how they justified what they did. The Russians have had similar Volkish style movements. Communism is basically a form of nationalism. The way it was interpreted in latter days by people like Stalin, it was a nationalist movement, a racial nationalist movement too. What did Stalin do to all of these marginal minorities within what had become the Russian Empire and then the USSR? He purged them. He moved them around. He settled white Russian families that were part of that white Russian heritage in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in all of this other land that had been the place where other groups had lived, in some cases for thousands of years. It was a racially nationalist movement. Communism was just the economic ideology. It was the excuse by virtue of which the people were purged. Well, we have to do it for the benefit of the motherland. It was just an excuse. The Nazi movement was essentially the same. Oh, well, we're Volkish now. We're for the German people. In reality, it's just a form of imperialism. They went into other states that had declared sovereignty, that had been recognized as sovereign, in order to do so. At the same time, the British, the French, the United States all did the same thing. The British and the French went after Africa and parts of Asia and parts of Latin America, and the British had gobbled up Oceania, and the United States was in all of these, Hawaii, and bought Alaska, which already had native people living there, Puerto Rico, getting involved in Panama, all of these other places. The Philippines, the Spanish, and then the United States as well later in the Philippines. The United States twice, because the Japanese actually marched in during the Second World War, and the United States had to kick them back out. The problem with a prophetic convergence is that enough people can believe in it to make it true. Now, it won't be true the way the prophecies necessarily state, unless they were truly divinely inspired. What it can do is change their behavior, make them paranoid, make them, if somebody is waiting, if somebody is sure that the end is upon us, they will act differently than if they don't think so. And that becomes dangerous. And it's even more dangerous when a large number of Christians, some Muslims, a large number of at least the religious or Zionist Jews, New Agers and hippies and psychonauts and all sorts of different people believe in these different prophetic systems. It doesn't matter if they debate over the minutiae of these different prophecies. All that matters is that they are becoming culturally paranoid during a period where people would be paranoid anyway. There's a lot of war and struggle going on in the world right now. We haven't seen this level of open violence since about the World War II period. During the Cold War, there was a stalemate between the great nuclear powers of the world. Largely, it was a Cold War. It wasn't open fighting. It was some proxy conflicts, Vietnam, Korea, something like that. Outside of those zones, a lot of areas for a while were relatively stable. They are beginning to collapse now. The world economy is currently on the ropes. It is beginning now to collapse. Now, they say, oh, it's a correction. It's a collapse. If you correct back to the long-term actual value of the Dow Jones, it's going to lose another 7,000 points. That's a collapse. Businesses will go under. People will be unemployed. There will be problems. As a result of that, you're talking about a major recession / possible depression. And it would be worldwide, because China's going through it too. The last time around, China got dragged down, but it didn't enter a recession. They suffered, but their economy was still largely intact. If the Chinese economy, the second largest, the US economy, the largest, and all the other associated economies begin to break down at the same time, it probably will be a depression. It'll probably be about the same as the Great Depression. And the problem is, if that actually happens, all these other prophecies gain more credence to the people that believe in them. They'll say, oh shit, the end really is upon us. There's going to be a nuclear war, asteroids are going to come, floods, earthquakes, whatever, a massive war. It doesn't really matter, but the end is definitely upon us. People will be building doomsday bunkers and, sort of holding up the sandwich boards in the streets saying the end is nigh. And it will become, eventually, if the culture's paranoia becomes pronounced enough, it becomes a self-feeding cycle. And then these people begin to destabilize the society and the economy. And this leads to more paranoia, more people join their ranks. The destabilization continues and becomes more pronounced. Eventually, you lose control of the situation. That's what can happen in one of these situations. And it probably will. Given enough time, such a convergence will happen. Can we say that it's this time around? Maybe, maybe not. You can't tell the future specifically because you can't determine which, if any, of these prophecies are going to be accurate. I would say probably none of them in their totality. But they do all talk about a time of great struggle, a time of the end of a cycle, the time of the end of the world. We're rebuilding this temple, this person, this Messiah or whatever comes back, these people get destroyed, and you'll end up with a feud between all of these different groups in which they'll probably start to butcher one another, especially in the Middle East. It would be rather astonishing. What would happen if a couple of armies actually met next to Tel Megiddo and started fighting? Oh, you'd have so many people pronouncing that the end was here. You'd have 100 million people convinced of it. They'd be rioting in the streets. They'd go absolutely apeshit. The problem is it's possible for that to happen, and probably, in the eventuality of time, will. People who believe literally in prophecy can become unstable if it looks to them, if they interpret it as being valid, number one, and number two, if they deem it to be happening currently. And that's the problem. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it becomes more virulent when you have a convergence of multiple prophetic systems. So that would be my warning to people is, be careful around people who actually believe that the end times are definitively upon us, or that the end of some great cycle is happening, or that, the moon's going to turn to blood and asteroids will start raining down or something, because when you're feeding into their beliefs in any way, shape, or form, even showing interest in them, you are giving them additional paranoia. And there are hundreds of millions of people currently in the world that believe in such things and believe that they are currently happening on this planet. It is a higher proportion than ever before, I believe. At least since World War II, there were people convinced that the end had come then as well. You could argue that that was correct. The end of a cycle did come. The end of the old order of all of these sort of disassociating states fighting over sometimes minute chunks of land, or control of a chunk of ocean, or a mine, or a cultural core, sort of went by the wayside. All of a sudden, the world was amalgamated under a bipolar system of the East and West, of the communists and the capitalists, of the USSR, generally speaking, and its sphere, and the United States, NATO, and its sphere. And so you could argue that that was almost correct. World War I was much the same, although that was really just a great war, not really a world war. It was largely taking place in Europe, let's face it. Didn't involve, you didn't see people from Latin America really getting involved. Maybe some partisans or some mercenaries or something, but did Peru suddenly declare war upon, the Nicaraguans or something like that? No, it was a European brothers' war, really, among all of these white European states fighting over, again, land and the fact that they had a complicated web of alliances. So yeah, people need to be aware. We are seeing prophetic convergence right now, and while you don't have to believe in any of these prophecies at all, or even the idea of prophecy, a lot of people do believe in them. That's the problem. In fact, there are politicians who believe in such things. There are military generals that believe in such things. There are definitely spiritual leaders who can whip up their crowds into a frenzy who believe in such things. It's a recipe for disaster, really, when you think about it. So that would be my warning to the world. And I would, secondly to that, yeah, it is a little bit like the 1930s right now. Yeah, the world is going through that period of social alienation and paranoia yet again. That's about all. Peace out.